let's get started here. Thanks again for joining me. I really, really appreciate it. It's a beautiful Oregon day here. I hope wherever you are, it's a beautiful, nice day. Um, Today we have a nice landscape live photo edit planned. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to start out with your with a landscape, and we're going to talk about some different ways that we can go in and modify it. And then we'll discuss sort of the process afterwards. And we'll do that for about 2 to 3 landscapes. I'm hoping 3, but it could be a bit more in depth and we could just get to 2. Um, One thing about this webinar, this is our first landscape live edit and photo discussion. So it was originally supposed to be sort of an on one plus thing, but we allowed everyone to join because it's an awesome fun time with everybody to discuss these landscapes and to show how to, process them. Um, with that being said, as a Plus member in the future, you're able to go in and you can decide which photos that we edit during these live photo discussions and edits. You also get to access you also get to access the recording for the event later on so that you can watch it at your leisure. You also get to access the raw files so that you can follow along during the live edit. So again, this is open to everybody, but if you're a Plus member, you get those sort of added benefits along with it. So we're going to start with this photograph. This was your most chosen photograph. We sent out a poll to the On1 Plus community, and this was the highest rated photograph in the group, this Milky Way photograph from Lost Lake. So with this, I just wanted to show the creation. So I've gone and I've modified this image. So if I turn this off and I select this layer, if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, this is the original photograph, but I just wanted to show sort of the end result at the beginning because this is where we're going to be going in and creating. So I'm just going to delete this layer here. And I'm just going to reset this Milky Way layer. So if you've downloaded those raw files, we're working with DSC00092 ARW. It's a Sony raw file, and I captured this in 2019. Geez, time's flying by. So 2019 at Lost Lake in Oregon, beautiful place to capture the Milky Way and to get Mount Hood right there in the foreground. So with images like this, especially when you're dealing with really dark photographs and noise, I know I'm going to get some questions about denoising this photograph. And just to answer it right out of the gate, I'm actually going to denoise the photograph at the end. I know that sounds crazy, but because I can't actually see a lot of the noise in the image at the beginning anyway, I'm not really too worried about the noise. And if I process it, then at the end, I can deal with any crunchiness or any awkwardness that the noise brings out in the image, because it can, especially if you're trying to reveal a bunch of shadows. Noise reduction and sharpening can really sort of crunch things up when you're dealing with raising up shadows in your photograph. So the first thing I want to do to this photograph, as I go to my levels real quick so you guys can see the histogram, is I'm going to go into the Develop tab. I'm going to grab my tone and color, and I really love using a neutral camera profile for this. So I'm going to go into On1 Standard. I'm going to choose this menu, and I'm going to go to On1 Neutral. So if you're thinking of camera profiles to use with images like this, I wouldn't recommend using any landscape or portrait. Well, maybe portrait, but not landscape or vivid, because you're going to boost the color and you're going to increase contrast. When you're modifying Milky Ways, you already have a ton of contrast in your photograph. You probably don't need more with an On1 landscape camera profile. I really like using this On1 Neutral to sort of neutralize things. It gives it a bit of a boost in the midtones, and we can see a bit more of our Milky Way. So right out of the gate, if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, it's already looking a little bit better, and we've only just chosen a different camera profile. So now what we need to do is we need to sort of brighten up our stars without brightening up the entirety of the foreground. And that can be really tough because we have a lot of dark shadow tones in a variety of areas in this photograph. So the first thing I would do is I would remove contrast. Removing contrast in our tone and color, if we grab this contrast slider and we pull this back, we're already revealing a lot more of this image, and we're not really muddying things up. We're not making it look awkward. We're just simply, bringing out more of these dark areas that we can't see. And that's just simply from removing that contrast. So I've removed the contrast about -75, -77. And again, it's just doing a nice job of alleviating some of those dark areas in the photograph. Now what I want to do is I'm just going to boost the shadows up a little bit. So let's pull up the shadows to about 20 or so. It looks pretty good just like that. Now, obviously, the sky is looking really awkward and it's not looking how we want it to look. So at this point, what I like to do is I'll go into the effects tab and I'll add a filter. And my favorite filter for dealing with stars is the curves filter. I know it could be an odd filter choice, but this curves filter is a really awesome filter for dealing with the night sky because it allows you to modify all of those different tones in that curve independently. So with my tone curve, the first thing I want to do is I want to bring in a bit of contrast. We've removed a lot of the contrast and we can't really see any of those details and stars in the night sky. And it's looking just awkward and bland. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to head over to my tone curve. And if you're unfamiliar with the tone curve, this bottom left point here, this is my blacks. And this top far right point, those are my whites. And everything in between is all of your different tones. So we have blacks, shadows, midtones, highlights, and then our whites. So I'm going to drop a point in my shadow tone, and I'm just going to drag it down to about there. And if you're, well, we could even give it a little bit more, I think, right there. So if you're following along, I've moved that shadow point. I've dropped down a shadow point and I've placed it 4 across and 2 up right there. And that's gone in and it's brought in a bit of contrast into our sky. And one thing we can do if we're just looking to modify the sky is you can zoom in to the sky. And so you're not focused in on any of the other areas on the scene. So I've dropped down that shadow point there. And you can see already it's bringing in a bit more detail into that sky. Now let's drop another point near our midtones and our highlights. And this is going to boost up those stars so that we can see all of that nice light that was there when we captured the photograph. So I'll just drop that and then I'm just going to bring it up a little bit. So I've brought it up about 2, and I could probably give it a little bit more. So let's go, well, probably right there. So we're about 2 and 2 in the tone curve. So if we turn this off and on now, I'm really liking what it's doing to the sky. And so if we zoom out, and if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, it's looking really nice on our sky here, but it's not looking that great in our foreground, and it's muddying things up and it's making them extremely dark and difficult to see. What we can do to fix that is we can mask in this tone curve with a gradient. So to mask this in, I'm just going to hit M on my keyboard. That's going to grab me my masking bug. So with my masking bug here, I'm going to drop this down. And by default, it's usually applied to the bottom. So let's just flip this with this smaller handle. Oops, sorry, it's exactly, yeah. Wait, what am I doing here? Yes, sorry. So we want to flip it with this smaller handle, just like that. So that this curves filter is only applied to the night sky. So we can see now, if we turn this off and on, it's really only working with that area up there and it's not working with the foreground at all. So let's just feather this a little bit. I might pull this down a little more. We'll feather it a little bit. And now if we take a look at this, yeah, it's doing a really nice job with our stars here, but it's also creating a lot of contrast in these trees right there and that mountain to the side. And that can be a little bit distracting and it looks a little unnatural. So what we want to do here is we want to go into this gear icon for this curves filter. We're going to select this. And if we go down to our shadows, we can pull up on this shadow tone, and that's going to remove that from those darker areas at the top of our image. So if we pull this back, you can see it brings back that contrast. And if we pull this up, it alleviates a lot of that contrast that was brought in from that curves filter that we applied. So if we turn this off and on now, you can see it's doing just a great job with the areas in the sky, but it's not modifying anything around it. So again, that's just this tone curve. I've created that S there, and then I've dropped down a mask to only modify the sky and protect the foreground from the curves filter. So everything's looking pretty nice. If we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, it's looking nice. One thing I might do is I might head back to the develop tab and I might pull back on the shadows just a hair. And then I might go into the effects tab and I'm just going to boost that a little bit more. Perfect. And it's quite intense. What I've done there is I've just grabbed that highlight point and I've moved it up into the left a little bit. And that's just going to increase those highlights quite a bit. And I'm making it a little bit intense. You can always go in and lower the opacity to any of these filters if you feel it's a bit too strong, especially I know you're following along. So if on your screen, you're like, whoa, this is a little bit too intense for my liking, just go in and lower that opacity, or you can just move that highlight point to however you feel fits the photograph. But I think this looks pretty nice. I really dig the intensity of it, and it's really making those stars pop in the sky. One thing that's looking a little awkward is the color is creating this sort of yellow orange haze over the scene, and it's looking a bit unnatural. So there's a couple of different ways that we can fix that color. My original go-to way would be to go into this gear icon area and we can access our blending modes. Now, one blending mode that is perfect for eliminating any color casts on your filters or layers or anything like that is the luminosity blend mode. So if I go down here to luminosity and I select that, it's going to remove any of the color modifications that come with this curves filter. So if I go to normal, you can see it brings back those colors. If I go to luminosity, it removes those colors, and it's strictly using this tone curve to modify the luminosity, the brightness, the contrast, and things like that. Now, in this case, it feels a little too desaturated and almost like the stars are black and white. One thing I would do in this situation is I would leave this mode at normal. I would go in and I would copy this mask that we just created. So we created that mask with our curves filter there for the sky. What we're going to do here is we're going to copy that mask. So go into the masking options. We'll copy that mask. We're going to add a filter and we'll add the color enhancer filter. Now in the color enhancer filter, we're going to go up to the masking options and we're going to paste that mask. Now it's the same mask we had earlier, so it's strictly going to modify the stars there. It's not going to modify our foreground at all, which is exactly what we want. So what we want to do here is we're going to go down to our color enhancer and let's just pull back on the saturation in this color section. Maybe about -30 or so, looks pretty realistic. And it's all just about maintaining that natural look. You don't want it to look wonky or unreal. It just got to look natural. And that could mean a little bit more saturation to some people and a little less to some people. Whatever your personal preference is, I'm going to leave it around -40. I think that looks really nice. And we turn this off and on, I think it's doing a nice job of just cleaning those areas up a bit and ensuring they look natural. So one thing I think we need to deal with here is our foreground area a bit, especially in the water. One thing that we could do is we could paint in a little bit of a blurriness sort of effect, and that will bring in a bit of softness and contrast. So let's go into the effects tab. I'm going to add a filter. And let's add the glow filter. The glow filter is one of my favorite options for modifying the water in images, especially when you have a longer exposure. It just works wonderfully on water. So I'm going to choose glow here. Going to go into the darker preset. And when I choose that darker preset, it's going to be applied to everywhere on the scene. And as you can see, it actually works really nicely in the stars, and it works really nicely in the water. So let's just paint that in specifically into those areas, and we'll protect our darker tones from it. So to do that, I'm just going to go into the glow masking options, and I'm going to invert the mask. By inverting the mask, I've taken this white mask, which was revealing the filter onto the scene, and I've swapped it so that it's concealing all of this filter. Now we can paint this into specific areas using our masking brush. So I'll just hit B on my keyboard. And with my masking brush, I'm going to make sure it's set to paint in. It's really important. I want to paint in this filter and effect into the scene. And I'm going to leave my size at about 1200. I'll leave my feathering at about 100, opacity 100, sort of everything at 100 so that I'm painting in the majority, the entirety of this filter. And let's just start with the water. I'm just going to paint this in on the water there. Maybe a little bit into this foreground section. Just like that. And if I turn this off and on, I'm really digging that. Now let's paint this up top into the stars a little bit as well to give it just that extra sort of oomph. And I might tap the top of that mountain just to give it a little bit more life as well. And I think that looks pretty good just like that. If we, let me move my head here. We turn this off and on. Oops. Got a couple areas I got to paint in. If we turn this off and on here, I'm really digging it. I think it's looking really nice, especially in the stars there. Maybe I could clean it up a bit on Mount Hood here. So I'm just going to remove this just a little bit from Hood there. So it's not so warm right there. Okay, so now if we turn this off and on again, it's looking nice. I think it works really well in this space. I think it's really giving these stars that bit of boost. Again, this could be a bit too warm or a bit too intense for some people. The majority of the people are watching this through Zoom. It could be tough to see those adjustments. So again, I'm making it a little bit intense. You can always tone it down if you're following along on your end. I may actually go into the glow filter and just lower it maybe about to 69 or 70 or so. That seems like the perfect fit for this photograph. So if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard here, I think it's looking really nice. I'm really digging how it's turning out. The next thing I think we should talk about is the noise. So with this photograph, we captured it with 3200 ISO. So not a ton of noise, but there is going to be quite a bit of noise because we are in the thousands. What I typically do in situations like this is I'll mask in noise reduction in specific areas. The reason being is that because these areas on the left are incredibly dark. And if we try to pull out the noise and we try to add in a bit of sharpening or anything like that, it's going to crunch things up quite a bit. So let me just show you how that would work. So let's go into the Develop tab. Going to go into noise and sharpening. And let's just choose No Noise AI. And so on the water, it's looking really great. And even on Mount Hood, it looks awesome. But if we scroll to the left here into these darker areas, we're getting this sort of crunchiness and this off black color that looks a little unnatural. And if you're getting that too on your end, this is how you deal with that. So we apply our noise reduction and our sharpening. So let's just increase this all the way. Let's apply this. It's looking good. Perfect. So now let's rename this layer. We're going to go up to the layers pane and rename this layer just by double clicking. Let's go into levels. I'm going to double click the layer and I'll rename this noise reduction. This is our noise reduction layer. Now to mask in the noise into specific areas, we're going to duplicate this layer by right clicking it and choosing duplicate layer. So we've duplicated that layer now. We have our noise reduction copy 1. We're going to rename this. No, let's not rename it no noise. Original. We'll just rename it original because it's the one that doesn't have noise reduction. Think about it like that way. So what we need to do now is we need to remove that noise reduction from our original photograph. So we'll go back into that noise and sharpening pane with that original layer selected. It's really important that you have the original layer selected. And we're going to select adjust. It'll do its thing. And we're just going to reset everything so that we have no noise reduction or anything happening on the scene at all. Just like that. So, oops. So now you can see we don't have that crunchiness. If we zoom in and I turn this original layer off and on, I mean, I would much rather have a little bit of noise in my foreground than have a lot of crunchy, awkward detail and textures. So, I mean, it's entirely up to you. This is how I would prefer to do it, especially because it does just eliminate that crunchiness. And honestly, a little bit of noise isn't the worst thing in the world, especially when you're dealing with a Milky Way or something a bit softer in nature. Anyway, so what I typically do here is I grab my original layer. I go into the masking options. We're going to click the masking options right to the left of that. So we're inside the masking options now. I have my masking brush selected already. If not, select B on your keyboard. I'm going to increase the brush size with the bracket keys on my keyboard. The right bracket will increase the brush size. I have my feathering at 100. Everything's at 100, so I'm removing the entirety of what I'm painting away. And I want my brush set to paint out because I want to paint away this original layer from those areas that I want to have noise reduction. Specifically this star area and our lake here. So let's do that. I'm just going to use my masking brush here. And if I paint this away, you can see it's a little bit difficult to see, especially through Zoom. But if you're following along with those practice files, it should be really easy to see that get removed. Oops, I'll move my little floating head guy. Okay. And I'm actually going to, well, no, I think I'm going to leave that dark area over there as it is. So now if we turn this original off and on, it's taking care of those darker areas right there that were a little bit crunchy before. And so if we just clean this area up right here. Oops. Sorry, I'm just doing a little bit of cleaning up so it's not on this post. Perfect. So now it's looking great. We don't have that crunchiness in those really dark areas. It's a little bit of noise, but honestly, I think the noise looks much better than those kind of awkward textures. Yeah, let's now take our two layers and let's merge them together. So we have our two layers. We have our original and we have our noise reduction. Let's right click that top one and we'll choose new stamped layer. Now a new stamped layer here is going to take those two layers or any layers that you have, duplicate them, and then merge them into one sort of cohesive layer that you can use to modify as a whole. Cool. So we have, I'll just name this final. So we have our final and then we have our two layers below that. And now what we can do is we can modify this image in its entirety. And what I would do here is I'm going to go into the develop tab, going to go into tone and color, and let's head down to our temperature and just cool it off. I mean, just like -10 or so, maybe even -20. And the reason I want to do that is to bring back that nighttime feel, give it that Milky Way look, because typically Milky Ways aren't incredibly warm. They're a bit cooler. And since you're shooting at night, it's going to be a bit cooler anyway. So just cooling that temperature down around -15 or -20 will just help to bring back that natural looking Milky Way light. Sweet. So I think this is it for this image. We could crop the photograph. That may be sort of the last thing to do. If I were to crop this, the only thing I would crop is just this bottom section. So let's just hit C on the keyboard. Well, I might crop in a little bit to the left. So I'm going to C on the keyboard. I'm going to grab that bottom left point. I'll move this over a little bit. There we go. Just a little bit more intimate, nothing too crazy. I don't think it needs an incredible amount of cropping, but that does help to just bring the viewer in a hair. Okay, one last thing that I want to talk about with this image, and I'm sure people are noticing it too, is this bright spot down there to the left. Now that spot, I believe, was just coming from a head lantern or somebody going down there and capturing photographs as well. So what we can do to alleviate that is just, let's add a local adjustment. So we'll go into the local adjustments tab. And in the local adjustments tab, I'm going to use this darken preset. And it's set to darken anyway, but I just like to click that for people just to make sure. So it's set to darken. And we're just going to go in with our brush and just paint in a little bit of that darkening local adjustment. And then let's lower the opacity a bit. Actually, let's just reset that actually, or sorry, reset the mask. And I'll use a smaller brush size. So we're using darken, and I'm just gonna use a smaller brush size for this one. It needed a smaller brush size. So if you're doing this at home, make sure you use a bit smaller of a brush size. I'm using around 300 or so, and that seems to be working fine. And that does help to just alleviate some of that bright area there. Perfect. So there we go. Let me just grab this layer and I'll reset everything. And if we turn off our final layer, this is our original. Oh wait, that's not the original. Reset layer properties. Maybe it is. Okay, anyway, so if I turn off the final, we have, oops, sorry. Gotta turn off the original layer. So if we turn off our final, this is the image that we created. This is the image that we started with. So this is the raw Milky Way file. And in doing some quick masking techniques, a little bit of denoising, we've got this image now. Alrighty, so that's our first photograph. I was really actually pretty excited that you guys chose that one because I actually hadn't edited that image before. And so it was super fun to go in and modify it. Let me check the Q&A and see if there's any questions that I can answer before we move on to the next image. So I'll just hit Q&A here. So I have a question about removing contrast. So why remove contrast and develop only to add it right back in curves? Well, I removed contrast and develop to the entirety of the photograph. And then and then I added contrast back in simply to the sky area. So if I were to go, oh wait, maybe I haven't modified it, but so if I were to go back to this original, I can turn this on. And we'll just reset this mask. So in this original photograph, or in our original layer here, in develop, I have the contrast lowered all the way. So if I turn this back, you can see it gets really, really crunchy really quick. But if we have that contrast lowered, it makes it much more natural and appealing. And I've only brought back that contrast into the sky with this curves filter. I didn't bring it back into anywhere else into the photograph. All right, another question here. Another question, for this image, wouldn't just a luminosity mask be easiest? And you would think so. But because there's such a difference in the brightness of the stars and the contrast of the sky, a luminosity mask is only going to really target those really bright areas in the sky rather than targeting the entirety with the masking gradient. Some cases it may work out really well using a luminosity mask, but I've found that this way, using your masking gradient to paint in the curves and the color enhancer, and then removing the shadows from them with the gear icon, I found that that is the best way to do it. But I have used luminosity masks before. It's just I haven't. It doesn't seem to do the job that I'm looking for. Let's see here. A few more questions. Dylan, is there any advantage to doing the no noise before any other editing? And there could be. The reason that I chose to do the no noise at the end was simply because I couldn't really see anything going on beforehand. I could have removed the noise before, but I also wanted to see what my adjustments and my styles would do to that noise. Whereas if I were to remove the noise at the beginning, if I were to be modifying the image, it could bring back some noise. It could bring back some unwanted textures, some unwanted details. So I just wanted to take care of that at the end so that I could see sort of all of that noise and all of that texture happening at the same time. So a question about the mask sky option. Is there a reason why you use the gradient to mask the sky instead of the mask sky option? Yes. So just because the sky isn't so apparent in the scene, I wasn't sure if it would work, but let me see if it would work here. This may be a bit difficult because there's so many different similar colors in the background as the foreground, but you never know. Let's see here. Let me just add a black and white filter and we'll mask the sky. Yeah, I think it's having a tough time just because there's so many similar tones within the photograph. Oh gosh. Don't, okay, there we go. Did it work? And it didn't do too bad of a job. I mean, that's actually really, really good. This lake, however, isn't looking that great, but you can see that using the mask sky, it just doesn't get all of what you want it to do. And I found, again, just by controlling it with those blending options and masking a little bit, feathering, things like that, you can get a much more natural look than trying to specifically find each tone or each color with a mask. Sometimes luminosity masks, color range masks, they can get too specific where it doesn't blend and it can look a little unnatural. So just depending on the photograph, you may want a luminosity mask or a color range mask or to mask the sky automatically for you. But I've found that especially in Milky Ways, just giving it a bit of feathering, making it, a bit softer, things like that, work out a little bit better in the end. But yeah. Okay, let me answer a couple more questions here. We'll do 2 more questions and then we'll move on. I really wanted to show the next edit. So, okay, so one more question about no noise AI. So in some cases, would it make sense to do no noise first and then doing again after the other edits? Yes. My recommendation for no noise, if you can see every detail and all of those darker textures and tones and all of that noise in your scene, if you're photographing wildlife and you have this bright picture of a bird, but it's moving and there's quite a bit of noise, you can see all of that noise happening and it's really easy to denoise right out of the gate. But if you're dealing with a darker photograph like this, where it's a nighttime image, I typically denoise at the end just because I can see all of that noise and everything that I'm dealing with. And I can sort of cater the noise to the look of my photograph because I'm not going to sacrifice style over noise, if that makes sense. I'd rather have a really pretty looking photograph, a little noise, than a denoise photograph that has unwanted textures and details that I don't like. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so I think that's okay. And then one other question. So the webinar is being recorded and it will be posted later. The webinar, however, the recording of the webinar, however, is only available to ON1 Plus members. So if you're not a Plus member, think about signing up. You would get the recorded webinar, a bunch of awesome other features and things like that. I'm not trying to do a sales pitch right now, but the webinar recording is only available to Plus members and it will be on our website later today. So let's start with the next photograph. We're kind of running out of time here, so we'll start with this next image. This was your second most chosen image from the Plus community. Let me just click done here. Oh, why'd I click done? I don't want to save that. Yeah, I'll save it. Maybe not. We're not going to save this thing. Cool. So this photograph here of Smith Rock. So let's grab this image. We'll go into the edit module. If you're following along with the files, this is IMG 0387. It's this image of Smith Rock in near Bend, Oregon, more specifically like Madras area. But it's a really, really beautiful landscape area. And if you're in Oregon and you're looking for an awesome place to drive to, Smith Rock, Bend, probably the best. Anyway, love this photograph, love this area. And I was looking at these images because I took just a bunch of different images sort of at the same spot. I wish I would have gotten a little bit lower to give sort of scale and make these rocks, appear a little bit more grand. We can sort of fix that a little bit with our transform, but I do wish I would have done that in this image. The one thing I want to maximize or sort of capitalize on this photograph is the light that's coming in. We do have, some areas where it seems like the light is touching it and some areas where the light is a bit darker and shaded from these clouds. And so in this instance, we'd really want to capitalize on that scattered light and we'd want to create contrast in areas where we have little light and we'd want to create a little bit more brightness in areas that we have some light. And we can do that with our local adjustments. And we can, of course, do a little bit of that in the Develop tab. So with this photograph, the one thing I want to do here, I think right out of the gate, is just, again, change the camera profile. I love using these camera profiles. They're just an easy way to create a base look. So if we go into the camera profile section, I'll choose ON1 Landscape. Just like that. And it's already looking pretty nice. I mean, it's a little warm, but as far as just the exposure goes, I think it's looking great. And so we're going to go down now and let's add in a little bit of contrast and maybe boost the midtones just a hair. Just a hair, maybe 5 or so that we can see all of that detail. Now the image is looking decent as far as our exposure goes, but it's a little bit too warm. So let's go into the color section. Let's drop that temperature a little bit. Nothing too crazy, maybe around 5100 or so. And I think that looks much more natural. Maybe not that much, maybe around 50, 52 or so. Yeah, that's a little unnatural. So maybe, I mean, sometimes it just takes like the slightest temperature change, and then sometimes images need like thousands of degrees off. But I think this one is one of those just very gentle. We could even choose auto and see what it does. Yeah, 56. So let's just leave it auto. Pulled it back about 200 degrees. Nothing too crazy, but it does make a little bit of a difference because that image was quite warm. So with this photograph, again, I really wish that I would have taken it from a lower angle in a different perspective just to give it sort of that grand look and give these rocks that sort of look that they deserve. But we can sort of fix that in our transform section. So I'm going to go down into my Develop tab. I'm going to go to Transform, and I'm going to enable this, and we're going to modify this vertical slider. Now, typically, I wouldn't do this on a bunch of photos. I rarely do this at all, but in some situations, it can really help to just give your image that extra oomph to sort of show the viewers that this area is, as massive as it looks. So we're going to pull up on our vertical quite a bit, maybe around 43 or so. Obviously, it's a little bit intense for some people, but once we crop it, it won't be as bad. And of course, you can lower that vertical down if it seems quite intense for you if you're following along. So I'm just going to hit C on my keyboard now. Obviously, we've modified that vertical look. So now we have these two sort of areas where there's no photo. Well, we have to crop that. We can't just leave this as it is because it's going to look like there's no photo there. So let's just pull in on the crop a little bit. Move this around. And you want to just move it around. Maybe right there. Maybe pull out on the crop a little more. Just like that. And I think that does help quite a bit in just giving those rocks a little bit more of a grand sort of look to them. If I turn this off and on, yeah, it's a little bit of a cheat, but it does help quite a bit. And it looks a little bit better. It seems like we have a much better perspective on the scene. Again, if that's too unnatural for you or you don't like that look, feel free to just turn that off or just lower that vertical. Not a big deal at all. It's all personal preference. The next thing I want to do this photograph is I want to style it a bit. Now, with images like this, where we have lots of detail and lots of textures and nice light, but there's not a whole lot of interest in colors, and there's not really a set subject. What I would recommend doing is converting this to a black and white. Now, it wouldn't be everyone's choice, but for me, looking at this type of photograph, it seems like a black and white feel, just because we have very similar tones in our foreground, and we just sort of have this dark, moody sky. To convert this to black and white, all we have to do is go into the effects tab. We'll add a filter, and we'll just add that black and white filter. Really simple, the go-to filter for converting your image to black and white. Now in this black and white filter, we're going to choose our more options, and we're going to choose sepia. I really like this sepia look for this particular photograph. I don't know why, it just gives it a bit of an antique feel. For whatever reason, I really enjoy it on this image. So if we turn this off and on, it's just, I think it just works. Feel free to choose whatever black and white filter you'd like. And if you don't want to convert it to black and white, you can skip this step entirely and style with whatever sort of look you want. But I think a black and white does look good here. So now we've converted this to black and white. Everything's looking great. One thing I want to do is I'm going to go down to the tone in this black and white, and I'm going to give it a bit of a modification. So this contrast is really low right now, and we want a little bit of mood. So we're going to reset that back to 0. And you can see that it adds in a bit of snap and some punch into that photograph after adding in that contrast. So if we turn this down, see it's a little bit flat and a little bland, but with that back there, with that contrast back, we have that punch and that detail back in the scene. And I think it's looking really nice. One thing I might do here is I'll just head into the detail section, and I'll pull up on the detail a little bit. Because we're going with black and white, and because it's not really crunching up the sky too much, I probably won't paint in dynamic contrast into specific areas or anything like that. I think giving texture and detail to the entirety of the photograph with this black and white actually complements it really nice. So this looks really nice so far. I'm really digging the black and white look. Now it's time to capitalize on the light in the scene. One way we can do that is with local adjustments. So in my local adjustments tab, first thing I want to do is create a local adjustment that gives a little bit of contrast and darkness to these areas that are a bit muffled in the scene. So let's go to darken. We're already set to darken. We'll leave it there. I'll increase my brush size here. And I'm just going to brush this in. It's going to be intense, but I'm just going to brush this in to some of these areas that I want it to be a bit more contrasted. And I'm not being too crazy about painting in the lines because we can sort of modify the opacity later, but you do want to be a bit gentle with how you paint. You don't want to just sort of paint everywhere. You want to have a little bit of an idea on how you want it to look. And with smaller subjects comes a smaller brush size. So remember that the bracket keys on your keyboard, they do modify the brush size. It's an easy way to increase or decrease that size of those brushes. Oops, I don't want light there. Sorry about that. I don't want dark light there. And I think that's looking pretty good so far. It's a little bit awkward right now, but what we can do is we'll head over to our opacity and let's just lower that down a little bit. And then incrementally sort of pull it up just like that. And it's subtle, but it's helping. It's just bringing a little bit more contrast into the scene. So what I want to do now is do the opposite. So let's rename this one darken. We'll add another local adjustment and we'll name this one brighten. So I have my brighten local adjustment and I've chosen lighten for this. So I'm using the lighten preset. That's going to increase the exposure. So now what I just want to do the same exact thing, but to these brighter areas. And that doesn't mean to paint in light into everywhere that we didn't paint in that darken local adjustment. It just means find the areas that you feel need a little bit more light and just paint in a little bit of that local adjustment into them. Remember, smaller subjects, smaller brush size. And we're just trying to create a little bit of contrast in the photo. We're not trying to manipulate it entirely, but we want it to look interesting. And this is a really easy way to do that. You're just painting in light. And I think I might just lighten that entire area up. Cool. And again, really intense, but we can always tone it down. So just grab that opacity slider, pull it back all the way, and then just incrementally. And I think around 33 or so looks pretty good. If we turn this off and on, I'm really digging it. I think it adds in a bit of light. One thing we could do is paint in a little bit more light onto this rock over here. There we go. And I'm really liking that. I think that looks really awesome and brings in a bit more contrast and life into the scene. Let's just hit the backslash on the keyboard so that we can see our original. So this is the original. And this is with that black and white conversion and then those local adjustments painted in there. We talked a bit earlier, someone had a question about using the mask sky command. This situation, I think, is a perfect time to use that mask sky command, especially if you want to control the sky and your foreground independently. Let's maybe add in a bit more drama and a bit more mood and control those two layers independently. And this may give you an idea on how to use the mask sky command really effectively. So let's first modify our foreground and then we can match. So I'm going to add a filter and let's just make it a bit moody. And again, if this is too moody or too dramatic, no worries. You can choose any filter or look that you'd like. For this particular shot, I'm going to choose the grunge filter, which is a rarely used filter, but oftentimes it can give a really nice feel to black and white landscapes. So if I turn this off and on, loving how it looks on the foreground, not really loving how it looks on the sky. I like the detail in the sky, but I would love a little bit more brightness in the sky, or at least to control the brightness. So what we can do here is we're going to go up to mask and we're going to choose mask sky. And that's going to mask our sky from this grunge filter. There we go. So now we have the sky removed, and this is just applying this to the foreground. And I'm actually really digging that. I think that looks really nice for some mood and some drama. Maybe pull it down a little bit. So now what we can do is we can just use the mask that we created. We already created this mask right here. So we'll copy this mask. We'll go into maybe our local adjustments. we can add an adjustment. And then if we want to control our sky independently, we can paste that mask inverted, of course, because we want to modify the sky. And now we can control that sky on its own. Sort of like that. Really easy way to control different areas on your image independently. That mask sky command works really great for instances like that. I think the image is looking awesome so far. One thing that might look decent is, I'm not even sure. I think it looks probably fine. Whenever you have to think about what you want to do to the photo, oftentimes it's probably not going to look that great. Anyway, let's take a couple questions here. We're kind of running out of time. We only have about 7 minutes left. So let's take a couple questions. We might be able to jump into that landscape, but I don't think so. We're kind of running out of time. So let's see for questions here. So we have one question real quickly about hardware. Looking at a new hardware purchase, what would you recommend for Photo Raw? I'm just using a MacBook Pro, but any relatively new computer would work awesome with it. But if you're a Mac person, I'm just using a MacBook Pro. Works really great for me. We had a question about autofilling the sky, so we talked about that. So I have a question. How do you handle halos between rocks and sky? So if we look here, I don't think we have too many in, what am I doing here? There we go. If we look, we don't have too many in this particular photograph. The best way to deal with rocks or halos on rocks is to match up the exposures. So for example, let's do that. So let's just, here, I'll just go in here and we'll create a version of this. And we'll just do it for sky swap. Because honestly, I found that if your exposures are mismatched, then that's where you get a lot of that haloing. So I'll create a version here. I'll just reset this. Sorry, guys, a little bit of housekeeping real quick. So I'm just going to go into this landscape here that we just modified. Okay, and so if we go into our local adjustment for the sky here, and we modify this exposure. So if we pull this exposure back, you can see, yeah, we're getting a lot of haloing here in these rocks. And that's simply because these rocks, the exposure isn't matching up on the back end. Now, one thing you could do in this situation, you could grab your grunge effect that's modifying your foreground, and you could match up the exposures that way. But it's a little bit too difficult. So I would recommend always sort of matching up your sky with your foreground exposure. In this case, we need to brighten it up a little bit. Probably not that much. See, even there, if I zoom in, there's a little bit of haloing going on right in that section. And that's just with, I mean, a little bit of modification. So if we pull it up a little bit, it helps. So again, dealing with halos, I would definitely recommend just making sure the exposures match. And I think this looks like a halo, but I don't think it is. Maybe it's a halo from my local adjustment. No, so that's just the cloud. And I guess I exacerbated it with that, but I think this is just the cloud. Yeah, so that's just the cloud right there. That's actually not a halo. But again, when it comes to dealing with halos, always match up your exposure. Even oftentimes when you're dealing with portraits and you're trying to swap a background and you have halos around the hair, it's probably because your exposure in your background and the exposure in your portrait or your subject layer aren't matched. We actually just literally yesterday released a compositing tip video, and that's, I think, going to be on our website today. So if you are looking for compositing tips, that is a really great one, and we kind of talk about those things. Anyway, I That's kind of all I had for you. Let me check the Q&A to see if there's any other questions that I can answer. So we have a question about camera profiles. If you're not seeing your camera profile menu accessible, if it's grayed out and not available, that is because you're dealing with a process file like a JPEG or something that's actually been processed. If you were to open up a raw image file, um, then you would be able to see the camera profile menu. Alrighty. Well, I think that's everything I could show you guys. I really, really appreciate you spending the time today to go over this live edit with me. It was super fun. I hope you learned a lot about editing, different types of landscapes. Again, if you're a Plus member, this will be recorded and you can watch it later. Also, if you're a Plus member, you are able to decide the next images for our live edit, and they happen every month. So sign up to be a Plus member. You get to decide the images. You download the raw files to practice along. You get access to the recording. And we also discuss this in our On1 Plus forum. So we'll be discussing this landscape live edit later on in the forums. So if you're a Plus member and you want to join in on that, feel free. We'll be in there later today. Again, thanks so much for joining me, everyone. I really, really appreciate it. I'll see you next month for our next live edit and photo discussion.